Welcome to the Mary Mavis Show, the show that focuses on remarkable results and your personal power. Here is your host, Mary Mavis.
In today's episode, we're going to hear from two experts on how companies think about compensation and what you can do to understand the particular philosophy and structure of compensation system of your current employer. I met and worked with both of my guests at S2E16 Company, a strategic HR consulting firm best known for its compensation expertise. I'd like to first introduce John Balkcom. Including his time at S2E16, John has 25 years as an advisor to management and boards in the area of incentive and executive compensation. Prior to S2E16, he was a partner at Booz Allen and an associate where he started his work in consulting at Hewitt Associates. He also led as the president of St. John's. He was a leader as the president of St. John's College for 3 years in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He retired from consulting in 2000 and has served since then on corporate and nonprofit boards. Most recently, he has served as chair of the governing board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists through calendar year 2021, and he is now the Bulletin's vice chair. In 2012, he self-published Before You Join a Board. He and his wife, Carol, of 54 years of marriage, live in Denver, Colorado. Most importantly, John is the person from whom I learned to always think about how can we help this client, especially when the client is driving us crazy. John, thank you for that bit of wisdom that I've carried with me for 25 years. And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Mary.
My other guest is also named John, so I'll be calling them by their full name. John Bremen is the managing director and chief innovation and acceleration officer at Willis Watson Towers, a premier risk management, insurance brokerage, and advisory company where he has turbocharged his career over the last 21 years. John thinks about his work as helping companies see the future and get there when it comes to people, risk, and capital. I met John in the very beginning of his career when he was an associate consultant with S2E16, fresh out of Northwestern University in Chicago. In between both consulting experiences, John worked for the Walt Disney Corporation, where I'm sure he learned a lot about the realities of organizations and compensation. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks, Mary. Great to be here. Great to see you, John.
I am so excited about this conversation because the topic is one that creates a lot of questions and angst and not knowing what to do about it for a large portion of my clients at many levels. And so we're going to start with the title of this episode, which is The Truth About Compensation. And I'm going to share with you 3 truths that I talk to people about when they mostly complain about compensation systems. So I'm going to share all 3, and then we'll go back and I'm going to ask you if they're true or not true. So the first one is compensation is not fair. That's what I tell everyone. Don't expect it to be fair and equal. The second is that even with the best intentions, rewards don't always represent performance. The third is organizations can pay whatever they want, make adjustments whenever they decide. So let's start with the first one. Compensation is not fair. True or not true? Anybody?
I'll speak up first about it. I think companies would tell you, sure, it's fair. but they would admit that it's fair within very wide bounds because so many things happen to cause variations in compensation among individuals of equal rank and equal position and equal talent. Something happens to change the game, to change a position, to change a person's impact on what's going on in the organization, and things become unfair to some degree. Things deviate from what the company thinks of as its system. John, what do you think?
I agree fully with what you said, John. I think in this day and age, there's a new way of framing the question, which is, what do you mean by fair? Because so many people, I think that fairness and sameness are the same thing. And, one of the things I learned on the corporate side, I think this is certainly plenty true when I was a consultant too, but on the corporate side, I remember my boss said one of my first days at work, John, paying people fairly doesn't mean paying them the same, because we're all bringing, I know we're going to talk about performance next, but we're all bringing a different bag of things to the company, a different set of things. And we're bringing skills, we're bringing performance. We don't change pay on a daily basis based on how well you did today or yesterday. So maybe at this moment in time, as John said, maybe at this moment in time, pay is a little skewed relative to what we're contributing, but over the year, it averages out the same. So there's the question about what do we mean by fair in terms of time period, in terms of comparable worth, in terms of contribution, and even acknowledging that sometimes paying people fairly means paying them differently. So I would say in general, every leader, every manager I've ever worked with in my career has tried to make things fair. I can't think of a single instance ever where somebody consciously said, "Oh, I'm going to go try to make this pay system unfair today." Right? People don't do that. I think what happens is things ebb and flow, and so at a point in time, it may not be fair, but companies are pretty good at truing things up. So I would agree fully with my friend John, and say even more so, though, even the definition of what it means to be fair is changing before our very eyes here.
And it's not in some cases, it's like the business and economic scenario. And so now in this, whatever you want to call it, great recession with people making changes, I mean, I guess some of them could have made changes for less pay, but oftentimes you're bringing in people for more pay, and it's almost like I don't think of it as bad that it's unfair. It's just sort of the reality of it, that it isn't. You're not for white collar workers anyway. You don't have a pay rate per job, and. Right.
Mary, I think it's a very important point, and as John Bremen knows from building teams many times in his work, you're bringing in new talent, and in order to land that new talent, you sometimes pay, I could say unfairly, you pay out of line with what seems like the going rate right now in order to bring in new talent, 2 or 3 people who are new, different kinds of talent, who enhance the whole team.
Right.
And as John said, it might take 3, 4, 5 years for the disparities to even out in connection with time and performance and contribution. But for sure, unfairness at a given point in time happens a lot.
Yeah. So it's true if you think about the natural sequence of payment across people's careers, but it isn't intentional that companies try to make it unfair, which I don't think people actually believe that. They're just coming through their own lens. So let's look at the second truth. Even with the best intentions, rewards don't always represent performance. True or untrue?
I'll go first on this one. Absolutely true. And again, it's largely because we're not changing your pay on a daily basis, right?
Right.
And first, and pay, and again, we can get into this in more detail, but when you look at what pay really is designed to represent, pay systems are meant to represent a whole mix of things ranging from skills and experience,
Right.
and sort of qualitative contributions to a team, as well as sometimes location, sometimes not, as well as value, competitive factors from outside the organization. Take your
Right.
fairness question. You have somebody who's paid, I'll make up a number, $80,000 today, and they're paid fairly for what they do. You bring somebody in, the market value of a job of somebody new is $90,000. So you bring in a new person at $90,000 that does the same thing. Now, for knowledge workers, Mary, you're right. We're not machines. You can't even compare two people even doing the same kind of work. Everybody's doing something different. But now suddenly, was the person you were paying yesterday 80? Like, was it unfair yesterday that you were paying him 80 because today you brought somebody in who's now paid 90? Is it unfair that person's only paid 80 now? No, because again, it's not just about performance, right? You asked about performance. It's about all these different factors that go into the mix, into the soup. So I would say pay is often driven by performance, but performance is one of many, many factors that go into the labor economics that drive pay. So that's my answer.
And that's a great example, John, because one of the other things I often say to people is when somebody comes in and, people talk about their compensation, you find out that somebody's now making 90,000, they're sitting at the desk and you're training them and you're making 80. And the truth is they probably made 80 at their last company doing the same thing. So, there is a natural way that compensation gets uneven in terms of, but I'm thinking about performance like your bonus and I remember at Simpson, we used to get bonuses every 6 months because that was the performance period. And I would have this, what I thought was a stellar 6 months, and I would get a meets expectation, and I would have, a pretty average 6 months, and I would get an exceeds, and and then if you thought about every time I got an exceeds, the firm did pretty average, so that brought down my incentive compensation. So even that is something where it's really hard to get it so that it feels like the bonus, the pay raise was related to how well you did in your performance.
Mary, if you go back in our long history, my long history especially, to the last time when we had rapid inflation going on, business economics come to play in this.
Yeah.
And, congratulations, Mary, you had an exceptional year, and we've got a budget for 2% raises this year.
Exactly.
We're going to give you an exceptional raise, and it's going to be 2.5 or 3. Those circumstances come to bear on how pay moves and how well it captures performance. And as I think John's point earlier is worth repeating, it gets ironed out over time. It doesn't get ironed out today or this quarter or even this year necessarily. It takes some time.
Yep. All right, let's go to the third one. Organizations can pay whatever they want, make adjustments whenever they decide.
You're not supposed to tell that secret, Mary.
Because people hear, we've only got a 3% budget and, we only make adjustments very rarely. And I always tell people, like, they can do whatever they want. Doesn't mean they will.
Well, no, and I think, look, at a time like this, and these numbers are on my mind. I recently, wrote an article on this. Times like this, one of the most confusing parts to people, Mary, is that people will say, well, inflation is going up. Why isn't my pay going up the same amount? Right?
Yes.
And, to John's point, back in the day, there might have been very high inflation, but maybe a company only raised its pay 2% or 3%. We actually saw that this year, right? Inflation is sitting now at 8.5%. And as of the recording of this podcast, and the average pay increase for most companies is like 3.4, 3.5%. There's a huge gap. And you say to yourself, wow, that sounds pretty chintzy. And so reality is, though, pay increases the last 5 to 7 years have been 2.5, 2.8%. This is like a 21% increase, right, in budgets. Are companies doing that because they want to or because they have to? Most of them are doing it because that's what they think the net increase of labor cost is. By the way, in the 70s, when in 79, inflation was 13.7%, pay increases were only 8.7%, right? But it's flipped, right? In 01 and 02, when we had really low inflation, like 1% inflation, pay increases were still 3 or 4%. In 2020, inflation was like below 1%. We still paid 2.5%, right? So, does this mean, Mary, that companies can't pay what they want when they want? I think what it comes down to is this. Companies are managing pay typically for thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. They have to move pay gradually, right? It's very hard to move salaries down in most countries.
Right.
So they're very judicious about how and when they move them up. It's very rare to reduce base salary in most countries, including the US, right? Bonuses go up or down. However, companies like their systems for 3 reasons. They like them, number one, because they think they're fair, right? When you start doing things indiscriminately and start making exceptions, that's actually where you get away from the fairness.
Right.
Number two, you're talking, the average company with 80,000 employees, 100,000 employees is spending many, many billions of dollars a year on their pay. That's a pretty big purchase order. You want to make sure you get right. And then third, there's all these laws about pay, right, that take into account. So I think it's not true that a company can just do anything at once. However, to your point, companies have a lot more latitude sometimes than they give off. And I think that's the calculus.
John, I think that's exactly right. And I think what that means in practical terms as well is that a company is paying attention to its human capital, recognizes critical talent.
Yeah.
And they know, like right now, it's the old phrase from McKinsey that the war for talent sometimes puts you in a bind.
Yeah.
And you've got critical talent in, I'll make up something, cybersecurity, where you've just got to hold on to that talent, and you do what you need to, and you don't do it on a schedule. You may do it unfairly compared to others, and you may not do it on the regular timing of the compensation program.
Right.
So they will make changes when they need to. And to some extent, it depends on what people know about their compensation as well.
Right. And we're going to get to that.
Good.
All right. So 2 truths and a false. Pretty good for Mary Mavis. All right. So we used to, in the consulting work, talk about compensation being a black box and helping companies, bring it more into the light so that managers first understood the system of pay, and whether it's base or incentive, and then ultimately that you give people who are part of the organization understanding of the wide range of compensation that you're offering them. So, is there a pay system in organizations?
Yeah, I would say 99% of the organizations I've worked with and observed over the years have pay systems. In fact, I'm hard pressed. Even the one company I think of that doesn't have a pay system, the fact that they don't have one is in itself a system to some extent, because they still have rules and guiding principles they use to allocate pay. So I would say there typically is a system. I think what people often don't realize is the system itself, the structure, doesn't really mean anything until it's applied to people. And they sometimes confuse the system with the application to people. What I mean by that is most pay systems have ranges and grades and levels. But the way companies administer those levels can be very, very different. Some companies move people through quickly, some slowly, some, this performer, that performer, right? So I think I've observed during my career over the last, few decades, companies have become more and more transparent in their pages. I think somewhere along the lines, leaders realized, I'm spending all these millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on pay. Kind of doesn't mean anything if people don't understand, right, the messages associated with it, right?
Right.
And it's like the old story, how much is a 401k plan, not pay, it's a benefit, but how much is a 401k plan worth to someone who doesn't know they have it? Well, nothing. But same thing. If people don't understand why we're giving them base pay, how can they modify their behavior to meet the objectives of the company if they don't understand how we're rewarding them? Same for bonuses, right. Same for stock. So I would say the vast majority of companies I've ever worked with have systems, but there's a big difference between how the system's designed and how it's applied to a specific individual.
And probably the exception is a very small company where they have compensation, they pay people, but maybe not a system around it.
Sure. Although I would say my smallest client ever had 4 people, and they had a system, and the system was the 2 owners decided what the other 2 people got.
Oh, yes.
That was a system, right? That was a system. And from a behavioral economics perspective, that those 2 other people knew what they needed to do in order to get more pay from those 2 owners, right?
And if they didn't, they should have taken accountability to find out.
Exactly.
Well, John, you touched just briefly on the why question. And I think that's at the center of this conversation.
Yeah.
Is a company telling its people why they do what they do with compensation. It's not just a system so we pay people. It's a system based on how we read the world we live in and compete in. It's based on what kind of particular talent we really need. It's based on how we beat our competition. It's based on how we develop people in the organization over 3, 5, 10, 15 years, and how we recognize their success. And saying why to those things is revelatory for most people. Now I get it. And they might disagree. They might think that's a terrible idea. That's fine. Maybe need to work for someone else. But this company has its own answers to the why question about how they compensate people. And I think that's at the center of whether there's a compensation system or not, Mary.
Yeah, and I don't work in compensation or performance management any longer, but my listening is through managers who are frustrated or employees who are frustrated with not knowing what the system is, and so I think there's a lot of tactical things that need to be done, to organize your proposal for people's compensation. I think some of the philosophy of compensation for the company gets lost. Managers don't really know, and maybe their philosophy is not clear, because I know from doing the work in the past that was part of the really important work that a consultant helps them with. But I think people get into this, it's, performance review time, and then you have to do the salary adjustments and, distribution of pay. And it becomes very tactical as opposed to, and then, worry about or get excited about communicating some pay number, rather than, putting it in the context of what you're talking about.
No question. No question. And look, there's an axiom that I learned from doing engagement surveys of companies and a client, and we asked employees at different stages of their career how often they would like to get performance feedback. And not surprisingly, early career workers want performance now. In this day and age, they actually want it hourly, like the
Yes.
workers, because everything is instantaneous in their world, right? Everything is now, and you have apps and all the responses, and you get out of school and you go work for a company, and suddenly everything seems slower. Then you get into sort of the middle generations, and they want performance like weekly or monthly. Then you get into people who want it quarterly, and then you get into people closest to retirement who want performance never. How's never? Never good for you. I know my job. Right. Thank you, Mr. or Ms. Manager, but I know my job. Right. I'm good. Right. That, believe it or not, translates to the pay discussions too, because
Right.
managers need to understand who they're dealing with. Right. And managers need to understand how to harness the power of the pay system. One would think one manages a very early career, employee very differently than one who's far more experienced than they are.
Right.
Right. And that, I think, gets to not only managers' facility with the system itself, and some managers are better at administering things than others. Some are better than communicating, but also, also the impact it has, I think, Mary, on the question you asked.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, John Bremen, I'm going to stay with you for the next question. How do organizations think about compensation systems? What are the elements?
Usually in a well, and I'm going to start by talking about total rewards, because people hear about total rewards.
Perfect.
Right? You start with total rewards, which now is part of what people call the employee value proposition, right? And the employee value proposition, back in the day, we called it the deal, right? And the deal was the purpose of your work, and purpose has obviously become a much bigger deal now. The work itself, I'm going to go work at this company because they let me do what kind of work I want to do. I'm an engineer, I'm a scientist, I'm a consultant, I'm an attorney, I'm a salesperson. Then the people I work with, my boss and my colleagues, and then the total rewards, right? And total rewards usually is pay, benefits, learning and development or careers, and then work environment. People talk about well-being today, right? If we then drill down into the pay, usually base salary is the core. Mm-hmm. Companies spend, on average, for all employees, about 85% of pay is fixed base salary. So ironically enough, they spend all this money, the 85% of the billions, on something that seldom changes. You basically change it once a year with a little tiny increase. The next element are short-term or annual incentives. Some people call them bonuses. And for senior people, right, at the top of the house, it could be 50, 60% of their salary. For entry-level people, it might be 5 or 10%, and it varies. It could be 0, it could be 2x. And then the third piece is usually long-term incentives, which generally is for more senior people. It's related stock, cash. In certain industries like tech, it's more. But those generally, the salary, the annual bonus, and the long-term bonus incentives really are the three main components that companies look like. But I mentioned all this other stuff because it's in the context of the other components of total rewards, which again are things like benefits and careers and work environment, which are increasingly important to people.
Totally increasingly important. And a lot of people that I talk to who have a beef about whatever their percentage salary is, I would say, like, you have this like really, really cool job working with really great people in a company that's been very loyal to you, who gives you special awards, and you have this really great career path. why are you worrying about another $5,000?
Well, or you say, is all that stuff worth $5,000 to you?
Exactly.
Right? Yep.
And it might be to some people because each individual cares differently about those different elements.
Agree.
So, let me just ask John Balkcom, salary and bonus. Let's keep the long-term incentives out of that. What does a salary pay for, and what does an incentive bonus pay for?
Well, of course, those two things will differ in purpose from one company to another. But in general, I think we've found that the salary is most closely associated with a fundamental level of capability in the organization relative to other capabilities in the organization. If I think of the organization as a collection of capabilities. And then the bonus, the annual, if that's what it is. Sometimes, as you mentioned, Mary, it's 6 months, every 6 months, or even every quarter in some cases, tends to be more closely connected to variations in performance,
Right.
both of the individual and of if I'm the individual, my part of the organization and of the organization as a whole. And sometimes those variables move in different directions. Great year in the company, I have a lousy year. Great year for me and my part of the company, and the company has a lousy year.
Right.
But generally speaking, that incentive compensation bonus on top of the recognition of capability, I think, is principally about some specific dimension, both time and performance-based, of performance that gets added to the basic compensation. And I don't know that I need to say anything more about that, Mary.
And so you mentioned this, John Bremen, that companies put a salary range for a particular job or a particular level of jobs. And when I started my career 40 years ago in compensation, we had 9 layers of engineer, both for engineers and a separate track for people who went on management, and the salary range for those positions was pretty short, pretty narrow. We did salary surveys, and we got data on all the levels. And it's transitioned so that there are I'm going to ask you how it is now, but there are broader bands with more roles and levels within the band in most. So how are salary ranges constructed?
Yeah.
And so to be helpful for people to understand, then what questions can they ask?
Right.
What's the potential for my salaried compensation if I stay in this role?
Yeah. I think the original salary structures were pretty straightforward. You would have ranges with what are called midpoint, and the midpoint is meant to approximate the market value of a job.
Right.
So you might have an entry-level job, and again, the math was very different in those days. I'll use today's math just so it makes some sense. But you might start off with an entry-level job at a midpoint of $35,000 a year, and then each grade would be a differential of 5%, 7%, 10% on top. And the range, the width of the ranges, you might go from 75% of the midpoint to 125% of the midpoint. Today, in general, 2 things happen. Number one, the ranges are much wider, right? Instead of going from 75% to 125, they may go from 50% to 150%. To give an organization the latitude in the name of fairness often, and in the name of treating each person uniquely,
Right.
understanding each person, again, we're not all the same, to give a lot more latitude so you can stay in a range longer through your career and give you a lot more flexibility. But also it allows you to have fewer ranges, because now going from one range to the other can be a bigger deal because it's wider, you can stay in it longer, and then when you go to the next range, it's a bigger step. So instead of 5%, it could be 8%, 10%. Generally today, ranges are much wider and broader than they used to be. But then also you have sub-ranges, and this is kind of a new thing, right? Newish thing. You have sub-ranges that you can have for specific jobs. So maybe all of us are supervisors in the company. We're all at a level that's, all the supervisors are the same level, but I work as an IT supervisor. The market value of those skills is higher than, say, if I'm a customer service supervisor. We can be in the same level, but we're in different ranges within those levels. So it allows a lot more flexibility. But what does this also sounds like it allows? It allows a lot more confusion. So to your point, companies have to really work hard to describe this so that it doesn't feel like black box, because it's not a black box. There's analytics and empiricism in the whole thing and objectivity, but if you don't explain it, it's black box. So, and usually each of these levels has bonus targets associated with it, right? So all supervisors, all managers, right? And so the modern structures are much more fluid, much more dynamic, and believe it or not, much more quantitatively linked, but they require a lot more explanation also.
I would just, I want to bring up here the question as well of how employees know what their potential compensation is. And Mary, I think you touched on it, that it's certainly within the latitude of the individual to ask, what range am I in? But as I've mentioned to you two before, I had a fascinating experience early in my consulting career when the team I was on was being recruited from all over the country and from people with new sets of skills and what have you. And it was clear that the firm was having to be more aggressive with pay than it had been historically. And so about 3 or 4 years in, we're sort of all looking at one another and wondering, how much is she getting and what is he getting? And somebody in the group pulled out an HP 12C calculator, and this actually happened, and put masking tape over the sum window and said, I'm going to put in my salary and add it. And then I want each of you to put in your salaries. There are 6 of us. At the end, we'll divide by 6, and I'll take the tape off. And we did. And all of a sudden, the 6 of us had information we'd never had before. We knew what the average compensation was then of this team of 6 who were all peers in the organization. And now I knew I'm above average, I'm below average, I'm right on the average. And everybody kind of walked away wowed by this new piece of information.
And half the people were happy and half the people were not.
That's exactly right.
and the problem is that now you have given my executive listeners agita for the fact that you've now given their employees an idea for. But I think organizations should operate as if everyone knows everyone's salary.
And by the way, today with social media and external websites and Glassdoor, people share information all the time. Yeah. But in my experience, here's the problem, right? You got to be careful what you believe, because people lie. And they don't always lie to others, they lie to themselves. What happens is people who are highly paid, they understate their pay because they don't want to be they don't want people to know they're an outlier. Because then what happens is I'm not going to be an outlier very long. Gosh, they're going to slow me down and accelerate these other people if all these other people know, right? Mm-hmm. And then people who are paid low overstate because they don't want to be perceived as a low performer with their team, right? So got to be careful what you listen to. But to your point, Mary and John, to your point, today I think people do their version of that HP12C exercise every day with the help of social media. And so, Mary, to your point, I agree with your advice. It's the old story. Assume that your entire pay system is going to show up on the front page of the New York Times and act accordingly.
Yeah. I once sent a computer printout of all the salaries for everybody from the CEO down to the janitor to a new employee who happened to have the same name as my boss.
Yes.
Really, really one of those bad mistakes. The good news is he called me up and said, I don't think I'm supposed to have this.
That sounds like a really good day.
So let's finish the work today with what are the top 5 questions that employees can ask their manager or their HR person. Maybe their manager doesn't know the answer to it. That will help them understand the system so that they can be an advocate for themselves for their compensation. I'm going to start with you, John Balkcom. What are a couple of questions that people should ask?
Well, we've already touched on one of them, and that is, what's the range for what I do here?
Yeah.
And how often do we plan on addressing not only my individual compensation, but that range? Take today, for example, in a very hot labor market. What are we doing to make sure that we're facing this labor market? And who are the key decision makers here? Who really has say about what this company is going to spend on top, as John mentioned, of the billions they're already spending for 80,000 employees? Who are the key decision makers about what we're going to do with compensation this year and next year and the following year? The other kind of question that I would want someone to ask is find someone who's been there for at least 5 years, maybe 10, and ask them if, to use John's earlier phrase, the deal is a fair deal from their point of view.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've been handled fairly? Do you feel like you've had transparency about what goes into decisions about your pay? And do you feel like your performance has been at least reasonably recognized? No company's perfect, but find out from someone who's been through 4, 5, or 6 cycles, how do you feel about the way it's managed here? Yeah. And, I remember early on when I joined Simpson, the reputation at Simpson was people who performed were recognized for their performance. And, I've been experienced over 12 years. When my performance improved, so did my compensation. When my performance dropped, so did my compensation. Yeah. A very simple transaction in that sense. And it worked very well for me.
Great. John Bremen, what would you add to that?
Yeah. That just reminds me of one of my first bosses here had a great line who said, John, you picked a bad year to have a good year. In other words, there's the company performance and then there's your performance. I would ask a question to really understand what the formula is, right, for say bonuses, what, the bonus funding and pool, what are the different weightings of company performance, team performance, geography performance, individual performance? That's the calculus that drives pay. I would absolutely want to know that. I would want to know if there is a salary structure, and if I can know what my range is. Most companies will communicate your range and sometimes even other ranges. Some will be fully transparent. I would want to know what the factors that contribute to a base pay increase are each year. And I would want to know what I can do to improve my pay. Like what can I do? I think those are 4 questions of mine, but those I think if you understand that, you probably understand 80% of what you need to know about your pay system.
And that's a great way to think about it, as less of a complaint and more of an inquiry, so that you understand what the system is and how you can perform and then advocate for your performance within that system.
Well said. Well said.
So I want to thank both of you for all of your wisdom of the years and a delightful conversation for me. Thank you for being here with me today.
My pleasure. Great to see both of you.
My pleasure as well. Thank you, both of you. Good to see you.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Today's show was produced by Eric Aubrey. Our theme music was written and produced by Eric Aubrey and Tim McKinstry. The show's graphics were designed by Devin Marciano. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on Google, Apple, or Spotify. You can also find episodes at maviscompany.com, where I invite you to sign up for my weekly newsletter. I hope you use some nugget to help you create remarkable results in your world. Thank you for listening.